should improve our practice.
So let me begin with my disclosure. I do have relationships with a number of companies, but I will not be discussing any particular products today. So, the ART trial. Now this should have made every one of us sit up tall and question what we're doing with recruitment maneuvers. Obviously a trial in which we have 55% mortality in the group applying an open lung approach should make us a little nervous about utilizing that approach. But then I look at the control group, and the control group has a mortality of 49%. I compare that to our study published 2 years earlier, in which in the open lung group, our 28-day mortality was 22%. The control group mortality was 27%, more than half lower than the ART trial. If you were to read the abstracts of these two studies, you would say they were done exactly the same way. The recruitment procedure in general in both trials were applied similarly. The control group was the ARDSnet study with the low PEEP table, applied similarly in both groups. But I would argue that we need to get into a little more detail and be a little more critical in our assessment of trials that kind of don't fit the picture of what we've seen with other things that have been published. All of these are randomized controlled trials that looked at the impact of an open lung approach. None of them show the negativity that you saw in the ART trial. Now, they may not show a statistically significant improvement in mortality, but none of them showed a high mortality, nor did any of them show a trend towards worse mortality in the open lung group. And if you simply look at the mortality of studies that have been published looking at ARDS and application of different techniques of mechanical ventilation, you'll notice that the ART trial is a complete outlier. I mean, the closest one is Amato's original trial in his control group where he had 71% mortality, but that was a result of a number of iatrogenic deaths in that particular arm of the study. The rest of the trials have mortalities in the 30% range for the most part, some a little lower, some a little higher, but pretty much in that range. Why would a trial ending up with such a high mortality today when all these other trials have a much lower overall mortality? Well, let me begin by looking at the recruitment strategy, because from this I think we can learn a lot about what we should not do during lung recruitment. Their original study said recruit every patient regardless of clinical status to a maximum recruiting pressure of 60 centimeters of water. There was no individual discretion on the part of the clinician managing those patients. The first 500 patients, or the first 250 patients who were randomized to the open lung approach, the recruitment required that. If you look at their results, 3 cardiac arrests, 7 pneumothoraces associated with the process of recruiting those 250 patients. They went back, changed the protocol, decreased the maximum pressure to 50 centimeters of water for the last 500 patients. But if we look at those first 500, look at the approach that they took. They rapidly increased PEEP from whatever the PEEP level was to 25 centimeters, held it for 1 minute, then went to 35 centimeters, then went to 45 centimeters. They held it at 45 centimeters at the maximum recruiting pressure. Now that was 60 because the patients were in pressure control of 15 centimeters of water. They held that there for 2 minutes, and then they did a decremental PEEP trial. They used 3 centimeter water steps in the decremental PEEP trial, and each step lasted approximately 4 minutes. When they revised this, they changed the length of time of the decremental PEEP trial to 3-minute steps, but still a pretty lengthy period of time. The other thing that was, I think, telling about the way they did this was the decremental PEEP trial went from 23 to 11. When they identified the optimal PEEP level, they added 2 centimeters of water. So the minimum PEEP level any patient could receive was 13 centimeters of water. Now, as you know, there are patients who 13 centimeters of water PEEP is too much, would be causing overdistension. They did not follow this as a protocol looking at the best decremental compliance. If they didn't find that best decremental compliance at 11, they stopped. They added 2 centimeters of water. They managed that patient at a PEEP level of 13. And of course, on the maximum side, the PEEP went up to 25 centimeters of water. The recruiting time took 24 minutes for the original protocol. When they made the modifications, it was cut down to 18 minutes. A lot of time to be at relatively high pressures compared to the way we would do recruitment today. Their approach to mechanical ventilation was a one-size-fits-all, and I mean very precisely defining how to ventilate every single patient exactly the same way. 20 minutes at least prior to the recruitment maneuver, they increased the respiratory rate to 35. That respiratory rate stayed at 35 throughout the whole process of assist control ventilation until the patient was near the process of being weaned when they transitioned to pressure support. They used volume control ventilation, square wave flow pattern, 60 liters per minute, tidal volume less than 6 ml per kilo with a 0.5 second inflation hold. This was during spontaneous breathing. This is when patients were triggering the ventilator, not simply during the control process. I don't think any of us would manage a patient spontaneously triggering the ventilator with settings like that. There was no variability in how they set it. Patients were kept at that approach to ventilation throughout the whole protocol until, again, at the ending stage when they were transitioned to pressure support. Flow asynchrony and the concern about double triggering had to be considered excessive in that population. The control arm used typically the low PEEP ARDSnet protocol. And if you look at their supplemental literature, they include examples of double triggering that they identified in patients. They had no protocol for looking at it. They did not have any concerns in the protocol itself about dysynchrony. And Marcelo Mato even has a slide that shows, which I've never seen before, 3 breaths in a row in stacking, not just 2 breaths in a row stacking as you see in this example. So that type of ventilatory pattern throughout the whole process, I have to assume, had some negative effects. Patients who were breathing with that approach to mechanical ventilation, I have to assume double triggering was frequent or significant levels of flow asynchrony existed on a regular basis. So our protocol was similar. We recruited patients, we did a decremental PEEP trial. Our decremental PEEP trial was in 2 centimeter water steps, but we allowed the discretion of the clinicians to determine the maximum recruiting pressure. We went up to 60 centimeters of water recruiting pressure, but as you'll notice, 12 of the 231 recruitments that were done in our trial were at 60. Those were done by groups that were from Brazil. Nobody outside of Brazil utilized that high pressure during the recruitment process. 10 patients, the clinicians, even though they were randomized, consented, felt the patients were too unstable and never did a recruitment on those patients. We accepted that because that was what was best for the patient at the time. That was not the case in the ARDS trial. We did 2.3 recruitment maneuvers on average in those 90 patients that were recruited. We have no pneumothoraces during the recruitment. We had no cardiac arrest. Clearly, we had some patients who hemodynamically destabilized during the recruitment. We stopped the recruitment at that point in time, managed those patients with fluid or vasopressors, and then once they were stabilized, we attempted to recruit again. Our approach to mechanical ventilation was pressure assist control. It was individualized to the patient. In other words, inspiratory time was set based on the patient's neuroinspiratory time. We targeted approximately 6 ml per kilo, but from 4 to 8 was up to the discretion of the investigator. And the emphasis we put on evaluating patients was to make sure that you monitor and do everything possible to eliminate any dyssynchronies, which again was not part of the protocol that was used in the ART trial. So what neither trial did, and what we need to do, and Laurent has talked about this a number of times at this meeting, is we need to identify recruitability. We can do that by looking at compliance curves at different PEEP levels. We can do that by doing pressure volume curves. I would say the best way to do that, if you have available, is electrical impedance tomography, because you can very easily tell if you have recruitability. You change PEEP and it tells you the percentage of collapsed, and it tells you the percentage of overdistended lung units. Flaw in all of these trials, I think, is that we did not determine whether patients that we were studying were in fact recruitable. If we do that and only randomize the group that the approach has the potential of beneficial effects, we may see different overall outcomes than what we've seen in both of these trials. This is data we have in press in anesthesiology. 14 patients, these are obese patients, but all of them had ARDS. And we compared different approaches to setting PEEP. Originally, the team managed them based on the ARDSnet protocol. We did an incremental PEEP trial focusing on end expiratory transpulmonary pressure. Then we did a decremental PEEP trial after a lung recruitment focusing on best compliance PEEP. And in both of those settings, well, in all of them, we looked at the EIT findings of collapse and overall overextension. And you'll notice that there was, as you would expect, if you recruited, a decrease in driving pressure, which again, as was said by the previous speaker, obviously is what we would expect if we've done the recruitment and the PEEP selection properly. There should always be a decrease in driving pressure. If the driving pressure goes up, your PEEP level is excessive. Something is wrong with the process that you went through. You should always see an improvement in driving pressure at obviously the same tidal volume level if you have successfully recruited patients. If you look on the left, you see the relationship of FiO2 on one side of the scale, and on the other side of the scale, driving pressure. From the ARDSnet to the decremental PEEP trial post-lung recruitment, PO2 increased significantly, driving pressure decreased significantly in that population. We also saw an effective airway resistance change. When we got to the optimal PEEP level, airway resistance was at its minimum or very near its minimum in this population of patients. If you look at the amount of collapse and overdistension with the 3 different approaches, you see different patterns. I'd particularly point out, remember, the incremental and the decremental PEEP trials in this study ended up with the same PEEP level, approximately 21 centimeters of water in this patient population. Even so, we found differences in the amount of collapse and the amount of overdistension. As one might expect with the ARDSnet, because of the lower PEEP, we had the maximum amount of collapse. With the decremental PEEP trial, consistent with the ARDSnet, we had the lowest amount of the overdistension. With the incremental PEEP trial, without a recruitment, collapse was decreased compared to the ARDSnet, but you'll notice still a large amount of overdistension. So the process of applying PEEP, what I've emphasized, it's not the PEEP level, but how you finally choose that correct PEEP level that has the greatest impact on how we would manage these patients. This is an EIT scaling of different PEEP levels and its relationship to collapse and overall distension. Obviously, you can see which one should be the optimal PEEP level, the one that produces the least collapse and least overdistension. To me, this is the optimal way of determining recruitability, and it's the optimal way of determining what the best PEEP level is in a given patient, because it gives you a visual feedback of specifically what we would like to see happen as we recruit the lung. We would like to see a lung now with minimum collapse and minimum overdistension. So how do we improve our practice? Well, first of all, as I said, identify patients who are recruitable. And those are the patients we should submit to the recruitment process, because we are applying a high level of pressure. The probability of problems during that process are much greater if the lung is not recruitable than if the lung is recruitable. Always individualize your approach to the patient. Don't be fixated on a specific peak pressure to achieve during recruitment. Determine based on the patient's presentation what is safe, and be willing to abort the recruitment maneuver at any signs that the patient is not tolerating it well. What we found is that patient size makes a huge difference on the amount of pressure needed to recruit. If you recruit early, patients who are of normal body mass, a recruiting pressure of 40 centimeters of water seems to work great. In these obese patients that we're dealing with, 50 centimeters of water is necessary to recruit those patients. Apply recruitment maneuvers cautiously. Carefully look for and minimize flow asynchrony and breast stacking, and that goes for any patient we mechanically ventilate. Specifically, in the recruitment, I would not exceed 50. If you look at the literature for the negative effects of recruitment, almost all of the indications of barotrauma, severe cardiovascular collapse, have all been at recruiting pressures of greater than 50. Staying below 50 centimeters of water, we have not seen problems. We have never had a pneumothorax during a recruitment maneuver at less than 50 centimeters of water. When we first started doing this at higher pressures, yes, we did see some barotrauma, but now limiting between 40 and 50, we do not see any barotrauma. It doesn't take a long period of time for you to assess whether or not the patient can acclimate to a pressure change. In the increase in PEEP, we use about 30 seconds every 3 to 5 centimeter water increase. In our decremental PEEP trial, again, we use about 30 seconds for every step change in the decremental PEEP trial, minimizing the time it takes to recruit the lung to a few minutes in most cases, because if you're at a reasonable amount of PEEP to begin with, 10 or 15, you rapidly get up to 30 to 25, which would give you a peak airway pressure of 40 if you chose a driving pressure of 50 during the pressure assist control. So limit the amount of time. You'll see that you have equilibration of compliance very rapidly as you make those particular changes. I would limit the amount of time at the maximum pressure to 1 minute, and I would again do the decremental PEEP trial in 2 centimeter water steps. So we should take the lessons that are obvious in this trial to heart, and we should focus on adjusting the way we do things to minimize the potential trauma to patients. Thank you very much.